We talked last week about the power of disgust in our lives. We said how disgust, when it is applied to people, is inevitably always wrong. It has the power to overcome rational reasoning, to create unconquerable boundaries, and to prohibit and stop the fruits of the Spirit. When we're talking about disgust in regards to people, we need to realize that it should be a word that is completely removed from the vocabulary of the church. Another aspect of disgust that we will talk about today is what is called negativity dominance. Now, I know it's a big word, don't get overwhelmed by it. It's the idea that when the slightest bit of bad comes into contact with something good, no matter how large the good is, it automatically corrupts everything. Again, all disgust has been found to have begun with relation to food, and then it becomes applied to things and people. As we talked about last week, disgust is not a trait we are born with, but rather one in which we learn. Children do not initially have any sense of disgust. I remember we were out at the fireworks with the Hollands last night, and I remember, it just made me think of this, because I remember Carlia saying something to Caleb, "Caleb, don't touch that, that's disgusting!" Because Caleb has like, you don't handle those certain things, right? So we are born with that sense of disgust. Children put anything and everything into their mouths, no matter how repulsive it might be. I'll give you an example that we have probably all seen. A child is thoroughly enjoying their sticky sucker. It's all over their face. But as children usually do, they drop their sucker in the dirt. Now the youngest of children, without thought, what do? They wipe off the visible dirt. Maybe not wipe it off at all, they just stick it right back in their mouth, right? This is a place where I have a lot in common with children. Not because I stick things in my mouth that I drop on the floor, but it is because I tend to drop a lot of things. I've grown out to have a healthy sense of disgust for contaminated food, so I don't stick it back in my mouth. But I do drop my sucker every time I'm sucking on that. So, the problem we talked about last week is when this idea of disgust gets applied to people. Because let's admit it, people are really disgusting. Not just physically, but morally, vocally, and offensively. The problem with negativity dominance comes when we allow the fear of their filth to keep us from embracing, loving, and accepting them as Christ would. This is what we're talking about when we talk about disgust and negativity dominance. The fear of their filth, whether it be rubbing off on us literally or just in a spiritual sense. There's no way we can embrace a homosexual because they are a homosexual. There's no way we can embrace a illegitimate child because there's no such thing as an illegitimate child. Let's get that straight right here. There is no such thing as an illegitimate child. Every child is a child of God. Period. Okay? We need to understand that right from the start. These things put boundaries. Disgust puts boundaries in our lives. It keeps us from embracing, loving, and accepting people as Christ would. When we think of it in the realm of food, let's give an example of our lemonade on a nice warm day. You're sitting, enjoying your drink, when all of a sudden, a fly lands in your lemonade. It flops around there for a little while, unable to escape, and you look down going, ew. Your face scrunches up, right? Okay? And what are you going to do with that lemonade? You're going to dump it and get a new one, right? Because that one little fly has ruined the whole of the lemonade. This is another one of the reasons why disgust is so powerful and should never be applied to people. Okay? In the realm of our lemonade and a fly landing in my lemonade, it probably is a good idea to get a new glass of lemonade. But in the realm of people, we must realize, acknowledge, and accept that every single one of us in this room is dirty. And if we take that attitude into the way we love, embrace, and accept people, then ultimately we have to come to the conclusion that we must reject ourselves. Quoting Richard Beck, when the pure and the polluted come into contact, the pollutant is the more powerful force. The negative dominates over the positive. Think about the implications of this when it's applied to people. One person can corrupt the whole. We must not seek to invite the world to church, but instead we must seek to barricade them from it for fear that they might contaminate and corrupt us. Well, let's give another example from Scripture. When Israel resided in Egypt, a new Pharaoh came to the throne. He saw that the Israelites multiplied faster than the Egyptians. Now, there were many positives the Israelites brought to Egypt. They brought a labor force. They brought shepherds, wealth, maybe even a military force if Egypt needed to be defended, and so on. But there was one single negative thing. What if? What if they chose to ally themselves with the enemy? Egypt would be overpowered. This one negative corrupted every bit of good that could be in the land of Egypt in the land of Israel living in Egypt. And therefore, the only option left to Pharaoh was to enslave the people to keep them from corrupting the stability of the country. We need to realize this is an acting out of fear. Choosing not to embrace love and accept people even if they are dirty is acting out of fear. We are never meant to live in fear, right? Our decisions should not be made based on fear. We cannot be afraid of loving or accepting people. Okay? Just because we embrace someone does not mean we are approving of what's being done. It means we are approving of them as a child of God. This is one of the reasons, this is one of the Pharisees' concerns. Again, and we're going to keep going. We've been going over this a lot. Matthew 9 through 13. Okay? Andrew was good enough to read that for us. Thank you, Andrew. This is one of the Pharisees' concerns. Again, they were disgusted by the tax collectors and sinners they found around them. They were unclean, and therefore anything they touched was unclean. We talked about this some last week. This included the Jews and the Pharisees. If these unclean tax collectors and sinners touched us, we're suddenly going to become unclean. If the Pharisees were in the presence of the unclean, they themselves might become unclean. They're so afraid of becoming unclean that they couldn't even help those who needed them the most. Their very aspect of law and decision was driven not by a desire to be clean, but by a fear of becoming unclean. They were driven by fear. As we mentioned last week, the Pharisees were so disgusted and afraid of these unclean ones that even if the sinner wished to become clean, the Pharisees would not dare go into their presence for fear of the corruption of their own personal purity. But if we look at the Gospels and we look at what Jesus leads us to be, it's being in the presence of those unclean. The being in the presence of those who would corrupt us the most. Being in the presence of those that actually makes us clean. It is in loving and embracing those who the world refuses to love and embrace that makes us clean. The truth that the Pharisees lost out on. Therefore, when these Pharisees were encountered with Jesus, in the presence of an unclean tax collector and sinner, the Pharisees couldn't even entertain the idea that Jesus' presence might, in fact, make the unclean clean. They couldn't even entertain the idea. It didn't even enter their thoughts. Could Jesus' good actually rub off on them? It was too dangerous. It was too dangerous. The only way this could work is if the negative overpowered the positive. Right? If the dirt made the clean dirty, there's no way that the clean can make the dirty clean. Just can't work that way. Never could happen. So their only thought was Jesus was making himself unclean. And they, as well, if they were to become a part of it, would become unclean. Again, quoting back, he says, Jesus doesn't purify sinners, but rather the sinners make Jesus unclean. An uncomfortable truth that has been found from psychological studies is many people, they found that many people refuse to wear sweaters that were previously owned by homosexuals. or even lie down on the same hotel bed if a homosexual used it the previous night. Completely irrational, right? We talked about this last week. Disgust is completely irrational. This fear is driven by the possibility that their uncleanliness, not physically but morally, might rub off on us. Even the presence of their belongings elicits such a response. This is nonsense that defies all logic and rational thinking. If sin is contagious, then the coming of Jesus was useless. The Great Commission was a suicide mission, and love and mercy not a spirit of the fruit, but a calling from hell itself. If we in the church allow the negative to overcome the good, then we are stripping the power of the gospel. It is not the good news that has the power, but so to speak, it's the bad news. The sinner has corrupted Jesus. Satan has trumped the church. The strip club, Satan has trumped God. The strip club has overpowered the church. If negative always triumphs over good, then even the contact of engagement means our failure and falling. But step back. Was Jesus corrupted by sinners? No. Where does true power lie? Was it in Jesus or was it in sin? Is it in good or is it in bad? Is it in clean or is it in dirt? There is no power in the filth. There is no power in sin when God is with us. It was not Jesus who was overcome by the sinner, but it was Jesus who rubbed off on them. According to the rules of the Pharisees, Jesus made himself legitimately unclean. According to the laws of Moses, Jesus made himself legitimately unclean. According to every earthly ordinance, Jesus made himself, by being in the presence of tax collectors and sinners, a sinner himself. The Pharisees clearly did not believe Jesus to be without sin. We need to realize Jesus spent a lot of time. He didn't just spend time with tax collectors and sinners. Okay? He spent a lot of time in some really seedy places. Jesus didn't happen upon prostitutes. He went to where they were congregating. He didn't just happen upon tax collectors. He went to their homes. Notice it says he called Levi. Jesus spent a lot of time in some really seedy places. That doesn't mean that Jesus became a really dirty, sinful person, does it? No, but rather those really seedy places became places where the gospel suddenly worked. Where the power of Jesus was suddenly displayed. Where righteousness was accomplished. Jesus is not corrupted by being in contact with filth. It is not the filth that is passed off. Rather, it's not the negative that dominates the positive, but it is the positive that dominates the negative. Jesus does not become unclean, but Jesus makes clean. The power of fear and disgust has told us that if we go into the homes of the morally offensive people, that if we spend time with them, that if we embrace them, that it is not us that's rubbing off on them, but it's them rubbing off on us. This is a lie of the devil. If we fear those who are lost, how are we ever supposed to reach out to them? If we fear those who are dirty and filthy, both literally and figuratively, how are we ever supposed to be in contact with them? In a word, we say the gospel has no power when we allow ourselves to be driven by fear. But while we apply disgust to people, in a word, we say the gospel has power. But when we apply disgust to people, in practice we say it has no power at all. Remember what James said? Faith without works is dead. So also, if we speak with our mouths but do not practice with our bodies, what we speak with our mouths is useless. If we say the gospel has power, but we do not go out and exercise that power, if we do not believe in it, but whether we are driven by fear, that our actions speak louder than our words, it says the gospel has no power at all. We also tend to do this in regards to memory. That one negative action, even if it's 10 years in the past, will always end up trumping the hundreds and hundreds of good. Once someone is corrupted, we act as if they can never be uncorrupted. Why do you think healing from our past is so difficult? It sometimes seems impossible. Because when we look at our brothers and sisters, the prominent feature that we see is not what's happened for the last 5 years, the good things. It's that one thing that happened way back when. They said this, they did this, and that's what we remember them for. They pushed someone away from the church, and now they're forever branded by that action. Sure, in word we say Jesus can redeem, but in deed and in feelings towards them, we still regard them according to that one negative action. One thing that I have said repeatedly whenever someone comes with a complaint about the church or someone in it, you cannot let one negative action or one person's opinion be representative of the whole and what it's about. Just because one person said something very hateful does not mean that's what the church believes. It does not mean that's what the church is. If we step back and realize, and I think even if we realize, if we look back through the history of this church, if we step back and realize, okay, was this church really that bad of a place, or was it just one or two things that got blown up way out of proportion? And I think we'll realize, even in our worst relationships, we'll realize that our worst relationships get blown out of proportion because of one or two things that got blown out of proportion. And we're allowing that one little drop to ruin a whole lot of good. The negative cannot dominate the positive. As well, one fault that repeatedly shows itself does not mean that that person is thoroughly unclean or thoroughly disgust when applied to people is crippling to the church. We stop thinking about Jesus' ability to cleanse, and we start seeing sin's ability to corrupt. You see the difference there? When we go out being disgusted by people, we stop saying, oh, Jesus can cleanse, and we start seeing, oh, sin can corrupt. And we become afraid. But what has more power, Jesus or sin? Who has more power in our lives? Why are we standing here today? Is it because sin had more power over us, or because Jesus did? Then what should drive the way that we act? The way that we feel about the church? The way that we feel about one another? We feel about those outside our walls in need of cleansing? Are we driven by fear? Or are we driven by the power of the gospel? Turn over with me to Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5. We read verse 14 through 16. Matthew chapter 5, verse 14 through 16. You are the light of the world, a city on a hill that cannot be hidden. Nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. We are the light of the world. Does that mean that we should be fearful constantly, standing in the fence to be sure that the darkness does not put out the light? not the darkness which puts out the light. It's the light which puts out the darkness. The only times that darkness reigns is when the church has decided to withdraw to the other room. Disgust is an irrational fear that handcuffs and binds us. We need to get out of preservation mode and start taking the light into the darkest of places. We're not called to avoid the darkness. We're called to seek it out and to bring the light into it. That means not being afraid of contact with those who might have moral failings. One of my professors growing up, when I was in Rochester, and he's now the pastor over at Otter Creek in Nashville. He was talking about poor people, and he said, it's not that the rich don't like the poor, they don't want to treat the poor, but so many rich Christians don't even know who the poor are, because we don't go into the dark places. The reason there's no light in these places is because we're not going there. We can't wait for something to come along. Okay, they're a little morally offensive, but you know what? I'm going to embrace it. Yes, that's good. That's great. But Jesus calls us out not to just wait for someone to come along. He calls us out to go, okay, where are the dark places? Well, that's where I'm going to go. He calls us to search them out. Do you know that one single homeless person in this church could very easily stink up this whole building? But in the presence of Jesus, that stink is a sweet aroma when it's present in the church. If the church is doing its job, the church should smell pretty bad. One single mother, one homosexual, one child molester, they will bring into the church discussions, questions, and even opposing opinions, which will make us uncomfortable, and they might even offend us. But if we believe in the redeeming power of Jesus, there is a but if we believe in the redeeming power of Jesus, is there a safer, more productive place to talk about sex than in the church? Where do you want your kids learning about their values? But those discussions don't happen because they're disgusting. And we silence those people who want to talk about them because it's disgusting. Let me tell you, it's much safer for people to learn about such things here in this building than it is for them to learn in the public school system and just out on the street with their friends. Because if we don't talk about it here, that's where they're learning about it. People will ask their questions. Would it be better for them to occur in the safety of the church or out in the world where they are not answered by Jesus or the church, but answered by the world? Isaiah 9:2 says, "The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them the light has shined." So who has seen what? Are the people walking in light seeing a great darkness? No, it's those walking in darkness have seen a great light. In the presence of Jesus, we have what is called positivity dominance. The positive will always conquer the negative. It could be one little drop of positive in a sea of negative, and because of the power of Jesus, it can cleanse that whole thing. Do we believe that? Because if we believe that, then we can seek out the dark places with confidence. We can embrace those who may be morally offensive to us with no fear. Because we believe that what Jesus has done in our life can spread and is contagious and can cleanse even the worst of sinners. Do we believe that? That we don't need to be afraid. It's not those who are walking in the light who have seen a great darkness. It's those walking in darkness who have seen a great light. And what is that light? It's Jesus. It's the church. In the presence of Jesus, we have what is called positivity dominance. The positive always conquers the negative. Jesus will conquer Satan. He will not be corrupted by tax collectors, but rather the tax collectors will be made clean by Jesus. The joy of the presence of the homeless man will be a greater impact than the repulsiveness of his smell. The church will not only stand in the presence of sin, it will cast it and drive it out. This can only happen if we choose to accept, to embrace, to love, and to show mercy, no matter what. We do not come offering judgments. We instead bring hope. Trust me on this. They don't need your opinion. They need your love. They need your mercy. We don't hold you at a distance, but we draw you close. We don't wait for you to come out of the seedy places, but we go in after you and embrace you even while you're standing in the midst of it. We're not here to hate your sin, we're here to love you. It's not the world that rubs off on us. It is us who's rubbing off on the world. We are so preoccupied with infecting the world with the good news with Jesus that the fear of being worldly no longer controls us. It no longer inhibits us. We are not driven by fear anyway, but by love and mercy, by Christ. We have not stained our perfect Savior, but rather it's our Savior who's made us clean. Matthew chapter 8, verse 2 and 3. Matthew chapter 8, verse 2 and 3. And behold, the leper came to him and knelt before him, saying, Lord, if you can, make me clean. And Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, I will be clean. And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. Jesus has come to each of us and said, be clean. And he didn't do it from a distance. Don't think that touch was just a little, one of these, okay? You got to imagine more like an embrace. Jesus wasn't afraid. Jesus grabbed help. Not just of that leper, but each and every one of us. And don't think we're any less filthy than that leper. We are found clean in Him. No matter what we've done, or where we've been, with a word, we are made clean. Leprosy is not the only thing that Jesus cleanses. So let us see, understand, and accept, whether it be us or some random person, all it takes is a single word, a single touch, and we're made clean. It's not the negative that holds sway over us. It's not sin that holds power in this world. It's Christ. As His church, let us go out like children, touching everything and embracing everyone.